Alrighty, good afternoon here in Louisville and online from Maryland to Manila, I believe. My name is David Buckley. I'm Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here at the University of Louisville. I also direct the Center for Asian Democracy here at U of L, which exists to promote teaching, research, and public engagement related to democracy and human rights across the region. CAD is thrilled to be able to reconvene our annual lecture series in Asian democracy after the disruption of the past couple of years. I want to first of all thank some colleagues who were really essential to making this happen. Brooke Ryder, Emily Clark, Tori Dahl, Anthony Hunley, Ijani Dasgupta, and the tech team also helping so much with the live stream, especially Josiah. For updates on future events that CAD is hosting, including a November international streaming panel on online disinformation with a special focus on India. Check out CAD's website or social media feeds through Facebook or Twitter. Thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon on a beautiful day here in Louisville to discuss one of the top challenges to democracy, both in the Philippines, across Asia, and closer to home. Online disinformation and the struggle for historical memory. We are thrilled to be hosting this event because it highlights one of the challenges to democracy in one of Asia's oldest democracies. Recently, from 2016 through 2022, the Philippines experienced Rodrigo Duterte's turbulent presidency, marked including by his drug war, in which thousands were killed and which remains subject to an International Criminal Court investigation for crimes against humanity. More recently, in May of 2022, the electorate overwhelmingly chose Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son of deposed martial law dictator Ferdinand Marcos, as the country's next and current president. The leader of the political opposition, Senator Leila de Lima, remains in jail, and Maria Ressa, a recent Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist from Rappler.com, continues to face conviction on charges of cyber libel. And more recently, a prominent radio journalist in the country was assassinated. As you'll hear today, the struggle for democracy's future in the country is as much as anything a contest over historical memory. Largely played out online, this struggle involves students, journalists, civil society organizations, and archivists working to preserve the historical record and democracy's future. And it's not an exaggeration to say that we have the world's ideal voice to address these topics with us here today. Let me take a minute to introduce Professor Sheila Coronel before we welcome her to the podium. Just so everyone knows, both online and here in person, we will have time for Q&A after Sheila's remarks, and so please be thinking of questions for her. Professor Sheila Coronel is the Tony Stabile Professor of Professional Practice in Investigative Journalism and Director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at Columbia University's School of Journalism. She began reporting in the Philippines during the twilight of the Marcos dictatorship, when she wrote for the underground opposition press and later for mainstream magazines and newspapers. As Marcos lost power and press restrictions eased, she reported on human rights abuses, the growing democratic movement in the country, and the election of Corazon Cory Aquino as president. In 1989, Coronel and her colleagues founded the Philippines Center for Investigative Journalism. Under her leadership, the center became the leading investigative reporting center in the Philippines and across Asia. In 2001, its reporting led to the fall of the presidency of Joseph Arap Estrada. In 2003, Coronel won Asia's premier prize, the Ramon Magsaysay Award, often referred to as a Nobel Prize of Asia. Coronel has written and edited more than a dozen books on the Philippines, freedom of information, investigative journalism. She has trained professionals around the world and written investigative reporting textbooks for journalists in Southeast Asia and the Balkans. She speaks frequently at international investigative reporting conferences and writes about global investigative journalism. She is chair of the Media Development Investment Fund Board. She also sits on the boards of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Columbia Journalism Review, ProPublica, and the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. She's also a member and former board chair of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Some of her recent work has been on the new Marcos presidency, as well as extensive and very important reporting on the populist presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, which just concluded in the country, with special attention to data and police human rights abuses during that period. So we are very, very fortunate to have Professor Coronel with us here today, and it's a real pleasure to welcome her to the University of Louisville. Good.
what is a journalist doing talking about history? Journalists, after all, are very much, we thrive in the moment. We have always been accused of presentism, of not recognizing the past. Well, it's because history is news, and the battle over historical memory is taking place in many places right now, even as we speak. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about my own history and mining my own memory. When I was about 20 years old, many more decades than I care to admit, I joined an underground newspaper. It was called the Balita ng Malayang Pilipinas, the Free Philippines News Service. The BMP, as it was called, published articles too dangerous to print in the newspapers of that time. We were living under a dictatorship, and the press was heavily censored. Years earlier, in September 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos had declared martial law, shut down newspapers, shut down Congress, abolished the Constitution, and ruled by decree. He said he needed to take drastic measures in order to save the Republic and build a new society. A metaphor popular at that time likened the Philippines to a volcano. The Philippines had by then been independent of US colonial rule for just around 30 years, one generation. My parents were born US colonial subjects. US influence over our political and economic life was palpable. We were a neo-colony, a pawn in the global chess game called the Cold War. US-style political institutions, competitive elections, a presidential system with checks and balances, a free press were in place. But the pressures on a profoundly unequal society were mounting. The volcano was on the verge of eruption. Angry students were taking over campuses, striking workers were paralyzing transport, and a dormant communist insurgency was coming back to life. In the South, the long oppressed Muslim minority in an overwhelmingly Catholic country were agitating not just for reform, but for secession. The country was being rent apart. The Philippine democracy, where a corrupt elite won elections through guns, goons, and gold, another phrase popular at that time, that system could no longer hold. Marcos's solution to the crisis was to crush all dissent. Like other Asian autocrats of that period, Suharto in neighboring Indonesia, Ne Win in Burma, Park Chung-hee in South Korea, etc., he unleashed the iron fist. He shut down all newspapers and broadcast stations and jailed thousands of dissidents, opposition politicians, students, unionists, and journalists. Many were tortured or disappeared. US officials were well aware of these abuses, but they supported Marcos. Like Suharto, like Park, like the Thai generals, he was a staunch ally against communism. Marcos also assured the Americans of continued access to their military bases in the Philippines, which were logistical hubs for the war in Indochina. By the time I joined the underground press, the Philippines had seen nearly a decade of dictatorial rule, and the end was not in sight. Military censors no longer sat in newspapers like they did in the old days, red penciling articles that were not deemed worthy of publication. But at the end of each day, the presidential palace issued press releases that were printed mostly unchanged and passed off as news in the next day's papers. Even opinion columns were directed from the palace, sometimes dictated by the president himself. This is what one-man rule is like. BMP, for which I worked, was an underground news service, a scrappy, clandestine version of the Associated Press, or the AFP, the French news service, except that It didn't have a newsroom, a teletype machine, or a network of correspondents. It had a small staff, most of them fresh graduates from the university like myself. We met in secret safe houses and wrote our stories on portable typewriters. I don't know whether any of you young ones here even know what a portable typewriter looks like. We didn't have access to a printing press because no printer would dare run the paper. So we typed the stories on stencil, mounted each page on a silk screen, and then applied ink on the screen. The same process now still being used for printing art on t-shirts. Can you kind of imagine what I mean? At the very end of this, I was all filled in ink, you know, my face, my fingers, everywhere. Normally, this process involved mimeographing machines, but we didn't have one. And it was risky to do the printing in shops, especially those near university campuses, which were being monitored by the regime's spies. We made 500 copies by hand of each issue and distributed them through the underground network. Some copies were sent to journalists and news agencies, and also the chief librarian of the University of the Philippines. There was a thriving underground press at that time, and BMP culled stories from the clandestine journals that circulated around the country. Let me show you how it looks. Very retro. Our stories were stories of repression and resistance, written and read on the run. The language was strong, strident, as if penned with a clenched fist. Printed on cheap newsprint, the papers were secretly passed from one person to the next. This was before mobile phones, texting, remember? WhatsApp, none of that existed. Keeping copies risked arrest, as Marcos had made possession of subversive materials a criminal offense. Now, I don't know if these papers changed anyone's minds or opened anyone's eyes. This was news intended to bolster the resistance, us. But it was impelled by a desire to document, to remember, so future generations would not forget. The urge to memorialize, to record for the future, the present, and the past is primordial. We write journals, take photographs, or before paper, etch in stone. We want a hedge against oblivion, to leave something for history. This was why we mailed copies of our work to the library of the State University or left them in the reading rooms, hoping the librarians would keep them. They did, and this is why I love librarians. They bundled the papers as they came and made them available to a few trusted users. Not many even knew they were there. For 30 years, the collection remained hidden in 2 steel cabinets. 10 years after the dictatorship fell in 1996, with the help of Cornell University, they were put on microfilm, indexed, and made available to researchers. In 1998, to mark the centennial of the Philippine Revolution against Spanish colonial rule, the University of the Philippines published a guide to the collection, which it named the Philippine Radical Papers. There is now a public archive of the political underworld. It tells a story very different from what was in the state archive or the archives of the censored press. It filled some of the gaps in the official story of the Marcos era, gave voice to some, not all, of the silences, and pierced through the wall of secrecy that protected power. The public archive legitimized the history of resistance. It also reinforced a heroic narrative of those years that foregrounded the role of the political forces that fought the dictatorship. It's a narrative prevalent in universities and among those in the progressive camp, who saw the opposition to Marcos as part of a long history of resistance, first to more than 300 years of Spanish colonial rule, 50 years of US occupation, Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and then dictatorship. Today, there is renewed interest in the radical papers in the history of the Marcos era. That's because another Marcos, Ferdinand Jr., the dictator's son and namesake, was elected president in May this year, 50 years after his father declared martial law and 36 years after a popular uprising forced the Marcos family to flee the country. The Marcos years are now being debated and discussed like never before. The Marcos family and their millions of supporters deny the excesses of that era and portray it as a golden age. They are relitigating history's judgment of the Marcos regime. That judgment was passed in February 1986, when over 1 million Filipinos gathered in protest on a major thoroughfare in Manila. Marcos sent in troops to quell the uprising, but faced with nuns praying the rosary in front of armored vehicles and young women offering food and flowers, the troops refused to fire. The Air Force pilots who were told to aim their helicopter gunships at the crowd disobeyed their orders. I was there when a huge crowd breached the barricades by then abandoned and unmanned that surrounded the presidential palace. I saw for myself Imelda's thousands of pairs of shoes, the giant bottles of perfume, and the other luxury goods the family in their hasty retreat could not fit in the 2 US Army planes that flew them to exile in Honolulu. When they landed, I don't know if you could see it, when they landed, US Customs officials listed what the family had brought with them. Among other things, millions in cash, 413 pieces of jewelry, and 24 gold bricks with the inscription, "To my husband on our 24th anniversary." I would love to get an anniversary present like that. Only later would we be able to account for the scale of their thievery. Up to $10 billion in Swiss bank accounts, Liechtenstein foundations, Manhattan real estate, paintings, and a mind-boggling amount of jewelry. So how could Filipinos elect by a landslide another Marcos as president? There are many ways to answer that question. The Marcos money, their political alliances, and the complicity of the elite families that rule the country. Among ordinary Filipinos, there's also a disaffection, not unique to us, with the failed promises of liberal democracy. But the Marcos restoration was also made possible by the fogging of historical memory. History is a battleground, and the Marcoses have taken back the territory we thought they had lost for good. They have erased the dark past of the dictatorship and replaced it with a halo of golden light. Not too long ago, the Marcos restoration seemed unimaginable. After all, my generation knew Ferdinand Jr. as Bongbong, the spoiled, party-loving son who grew up in a palace surrounded by security, servants, and sycophants. Today, he is cast as the fair prince who took back the crown that had been unjustly seized from his father by corrupt and greedy liberal elites. Bongbong got more than 31 million votes in the elections last May. 2 of every 3 Filipinos wanted him to be president. The judgment of history had been reversed for now, but the battle continues. The debate over and the revision of history is not necessarily bad. Since the beginning of time, there have been battles over history and memory. Today, even here, Monuments are being toppled, and museums are returning art looted from colonies. Long dominant narratives of racial superiority and imperial glory are being interrogated and overturned. There is a call for an accounting of the sins of the past, for the silenced and dispossessed to reclaim their history, to write their own story. At the same time, there is a backlash against that backlash. The lost cause of the Confederacy, the notion that southern US states fought the Civil War to defend states' rights and their way of life, that slavery was benign, is getting a new lease on life amid the demands for racial justice. In Ukraine, the war is being fought not so much in the battlefields of Donetsk and Luhansk, but also over the country's history. Russian President Vladimir Putin justifies his war by saying there is no history of Ukraine separate from Russia. Ukrainian statehood, therefore, is a fiction. In Hong Kong, China is rewriting textbooks, claiming that Hong Kong was never a British colony, that China never ceded sovereignty, and that Hong Kong culture is the same as Chinese culture. In both these cases, history is being manipulated to make claims of power and legitimacy and to justify domination and suppression. In India, Narendra Modi harks back to a golden age of Hindu glory. He has appointed a committee of scholars to write a Hindu-first version of history that says Hindus were descended from the land's first inhabitants. Therefore, they have primacy as citizens. Today, the vision of a secular and pluralistic India, one where Hindus, Muslims, and those of other faiths can live harmoniously, is under siege. Just 70 years ago, this vision united Indians and animated their struggle from independence from British colonial rule. It was premised on what the leaders of the independence movement saw as the country's uniqueness, its long history as a pluralist and diverse polity. Each historical narrative renews a claim to truth. The Haitian historian Michel Rolph Trouillot wrote in his book, Silencing the Past, a critique of the imperial historiography of his country. A consensus about history is impossible. The question, he said, should instead be, what makes a narrative powerful enough to pass as accepted history, and whose voices are silenced by such narrative power? I'll say that again. Whose voices are silenced by such narrative power? The means and the process of historical production, said Trouillot, are a function of power. Who has the power determines the sources of historical facts, the archiving of them, the narratives woven around archives and sources, and the retrospective significance given to actors and events. No doubt the Marcoses, like Putin, like Modi, have for now seized narrative power. All of them tell the story of a golden age followed by the fall, and then the heroic striving for redemption. This narrative structure has universal appeal. In the Philippines, a deeply Catholic country, it resonates because the three-part story is a familiar arc. Adam and Eve, for example. Or the Gospel, which tells the story of Christ's preaching, crucifixion, and resurrection. As various Filipino scholars have pointed out, nationalist history, too, follows this arc. Our national hero, Jose Rizal, wrote longingly about a pre-colonial Philippines wrecked by conquest. Nuestro perdido Eden, our lost Eden. He wrote in a poem penned on the night before his execution by the Spaniards. The history of the Filipino nation, glorified in both textbooks and public history, is the story of an oppressed people who threw out the colonial yoke and declared themselves independent. If that sounds familiar, it's because this too is the story Americans tell themselves about these United States. The Marcoses wove their story into the story of the nation. Ferdinand and Imelda portrayed themselves as avatars of the Filipino creation myth. Malakas and maganda, the strong and the beautiful. The first humans who emerged from a bamboo tree split by lightning. When he was president, Marcos hired historians and published under his name a ghost-written textbook called Tadhana, or Destiny, that portrayed his martial law new society as the culmination of the Filipinos' long struggle against colonial and neo-colonial rule. While campaigning in the 1960s, he also commissioned a biopic and a biography that threaded the Marcos myth into the fabric of the nation's story and projected the inevitability of his presidency. In this telling, the Marcoses are heirs to their forebears' anti-colonial legacy. Imelda Marcos has claimed kinship with a general who fought in the Philippine Revolution against Spain. The same general, coincidentally, to whom her husband's grandfather also reported. This claim has been contested. Ferdinand Sr. cultivated the legend that he had an amulet inherited from Gregorio Aglipay, the anti-Spanish and anti-American revolutionary who was a Marcos family friend and ally. According to this legend, narrated in his 1964 biography, the amulet, we call it in Tagalog, anting-anting, it gives you superpowers, you know, like the Marvel Universe. This gave Ferdinand the power to disappear and appear at will, allowing him to survive the Second World War. An anti-Japanese guerrilla, Ferdinand claimed to be the most decorated Filipino veteran of the war. In the 1980s, scholars dug into the US archives and found most of his medals were fraudulent. Some 30 years ago, communist guerrillas and later treasure hunters dynamited the 100-foot Marcos bust that had been carved on a mountainside in northern Philippines. The bust is gone, but the story of Marcos's heritage, of his bravery, his brilliance, of the era of national pride that was his regime has persisted. Never mind if the facts didn't quite align. The personality cult never really went away. It just lay dormant. So we are now once again in a Marcos spring. Marcos died in Honolulu in 1989. 2 years later, his wife Imelda and their 3 children were allowed back to the Philippines so they could face trial. They have told a consistent story. They were blameless victims of liberal elites who conspired to oust them from power. In this telling, journalists like myself, academics like you guys, civil society activists are all part of the corrupt elite. This story, however, didn't get traction at first. In the late 1980s and the 1990s, the democracy narrative was dominant. It was a triumphalist narrative. It portrayed the Philippines as the land of people power, part of the wave of democratic movements that put an end to autocratic rule all around the world. A world inching toward the end of history. Remember that? The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the socialist regimes in the Soviet sphere came tumbling down as well. Thai protesters dislodged another junta in 1992. Indonesians got rid of Suharto in 1998. But over the years, not just in the Philippines, but in many other places, including this country, the democracy narrative lost its luster. How could it not? Popularly elected governments failed to address poverty and inequality. Those in public office pillaged the public purse. Scandal after scandal hounded those in power. Open societies and open markets enriched and empowered the global elite, but left so many others in misery amid plenty. The story of democracy seemed out of sync with lived reality. It was just a fantasy. In the Philippines, the Marcos myth filled this narrative vacuum. It resonated among the disillusioned and disenfranchised. Like the Marcoses, they see themselves as victims of the elite. My generation grew up and grew sick, imbibing 1970s-style Marcos propaganda. The 21st century version of Marcos information operations, however, is far more slick and sophisticated. Over the years, the Marcoses have been jazzed up, remixed, restyled. They are now viewed as glamorous, transgressive, edgy. Their attacks on the liberal establishment are not strident or ideological. They are witty, irreverent, the kinds of things that are shared and go viral. Like anti-democratic forces elsewhere, they have weaponized irony and mocked the political correctness of progressives and liberals. They are thriving in an information space where there is such intermingling of fact and fiction the truth seems elusive. A rich trove of scholarship and reportage has documented the resurrection of the Marcos myth on social media platforms. The research shows the Marcoses had invested heavily on propagating their story on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. They enlisted PR agencies, paid troll armies, and influencers in their campaign for erasure and denialism. Today, the Marcoses have a ubiquitous online presence. The internet is their archive. Photos, news clippings dating back to the 1960s and even earlier are easily accessible there, ready for reuse by TikTokers and YouTube vloggers. In Trujillo's terms, the Marcoses had achieved both archival and narrative power. Social media, according to the Filipino media scholar Jonathan Corpus Ong, enabled fervent fan participation in Marcos family myth-making, folklore, and disinformation campaigning. Online influencers, according to a recent study by University of the Philippines researchers, were central to buttressing the Marcoses' prominence in the digital space because of their sheer number and the volume of their content. The platforms were used not so much for Cambridge Analytica-style personalized targeting, but for network campaigning. Ferdinand Jr.'s election campaign portrayed him as a family man, reasonable, likable, normal, uncontroversial. He had just one message, unity, and he stuck to it. Meanwhile, online, the Marcos fandom was hijacking historical memory. According to them, there were no disappearances or torture during the regime, and under Marcos, the Philippines was the richest country in Asia. Somebody should tell that to Japan. Some even claimed Ferdinand Sr. founded the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Marcos social media universe peddles conspiracy theories. One said the CIA, the Vatican, and Filipino oligarchs conspired to oust the family from power. Millenarian fantasies also thrived online. A popular one said Marcos Sr. was bequeathed tons of gold by a secretive Filipino family, so secretive no one had seen them or heard of them before. And this wealth would be shared by his countrymen once he was in power. To Americans and to many around the world, this should not be surprising. We all have our share of conspiracy theories and millenarian fantasies, now no longer just confined to the fevered swamps of the internet. Last May, on the night that Marcos won the election, I was outside the Marcos headquarters in Manila and saw the Marcos fandom at work. Dozens of vloggers armed with selfie sticks were doing stand-ups in front of a jubilant crowd. Many were diehard supporters. But there were also those who saw in the Marcoses money-making opportunities. Marcos videos, one of them told me, go viral. And so he shifted from posting how-to videos, how to change, those internet things, how to create a LinkedIn profile, stuff like that, to following the Marcoses online, to following the Marcoses. Vloggers earn from the ads on online videos and from contributions from their followers also made online. The Marcoses, these vloggers told a Rappler reporter, give them access, allowing them to create content they can then monetize. The many members of the Marcos family are highly visible in the public space. There's Imelda, now 93, the former First Lady, famous for her shoes. The current president's sister, Aimee, is a senator. His son, Sandro, is a congressman. His nephew is a governor. A first cousin is Speaker of the House, and assorted other family members are in public office. The pro-Marcos social media influencers do little original reporting, but instead mine the internet. Those are kind of covers of TikTok videos that went viral. It shows various members of the Marcos family doing dance challenges and singing and doing whatever. This one is, the one in the center is using archival photos and videos to tell the love story of Ferdinand and Imelda. There's little original reporting in these videos. Instead, they mine the internet where current and historical material on several generations of Marcoses are easily available for repurposing, collaging, meme making, and income generating. This is not your father's propaganda. It is co-creation rather than one-way information transmission. It's not a few big broadcasters or newspapers, but a multitude of micro-influencers. Some of it is astroturfed, but a good part of it is organic. This is the way information control takes place in the 21st century. No military sensors in newsrooms, no tanks rolling down the streets. For sure, dissent is crushed. The two Nobel Prize winners, journalist Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, can attest to that. They have to deal with online trolls, harassment, lawsuits, the threats of physical attack. But day to day, critical voices are silenced, not so much with the iron fist of the state, but through fake news, disinformation, propaganda, trolling, and often also meme wars and seemingly harmless and entertaining content. No ponderous, ghost-written textbooks for this generation of Marcoses. Instead, a few months ago, Manila cinemas showed a movie produced by Aimee Marcos, Ferdinand's sister. The film is called Made in Malacanang. Malacanang is the presidential palace. It's about the 4-day uprising that led to the fall of the House of Marcos. The story is told from the point of view of the family's household help, who shield them from angry mobs and weep as they were forced to flee. The movie is entertaining, even if short on facts. The maids of Malacanang are the Marcoses' ideal citizens, adoring followers who blindly follow their masters and know their place. But there is pushback. The battle over history and memory continues to be waged. This year is the 50th anniversary of martial law. The restoration of the Marcos presidency has made this anniversary a particularly fraught one, but it provided dissenters and survivors with an occasion to remember the abuses of that era, to memorialize the victims, and to retell the story of resistance. There's now a lot of self-reflection on the part of activists, journalists, artists, teachers, and scholars who were shaken by Marcos Jr.'s election and realized the big gap in public understanding, public history, and public education. A new generation has grown up with no memory of dictatorship, Their textbooks either normalize the Marcos era, Marcos as just another president, or extol its supposed achievements, the roads and bridges built, for example, but make no mention of corruption or human rights. The activist or progressive version of the Marcos years, on the other hand, is sometimes no more nuanced. It focuses on repression and resistance. Scholars, said Filipino historian Filomeno Aguilar Jr., need to dig deeper into the historical record in order to provide truthful and complex narratives of the dictatorship. It wasn't all darkness, nor was it all light, even if the retelling has been either all black or all white. There was resistance, for sure, but there was also complicity, whether by the elite, the middle class, or the poor. The seduction of strong men cannot be denied and deserves more scrutiny. Moreover, certain sectors of society benefited from the regime. Land was redistributed to rice farmers. Public funds were poured into infrastructure, and the economy grew in the early Marcos years. As one of the president's men remarked, Marcos believed he could have a vision for society and still loot it. Filipino scholars were terrorized by the regime, according to Aguilar. It was as though, he said, and this I quote, they shared in the collective trauma of all those who resisted the dictatorship, and it was best not to reopen the wounds because deep down, the scars were still fresh. The many rituals that recently took place, the rituals of martial law remembering, both online and in public spaces, indicate a growing desire to confront that trauma. The generation that bore the brunt of martial law are now in their 70s and 80s, and their memories need to be preserved. In 2013, Philippine Congress passed a new law that allocated $200 million recovered from the Marcos' Swiss bank accounts to victims of human rights abuses. A compensation board invited victims to present evidence of imprisonment, torture, sexual abuse, murder, and disappearance. 70,000 people came forward, many of them tearfully telling their stories for the first time. Some 11,000 were able to present documentary evidence, but many more could not document what had been done to them or their loved ones and were not compensated. The process revealed the many gaps in the history of the Marcos years. Among those who came forward were victims of a little-known massacre that took place in 1974 in a small village called Palimbang in Muslim Mindanao, the southern part of the country. The survivors described how soldiers rounded up hundreds of villagers in a mosque, killed many of the men, and raped the women. It took 40 years for them to speak out. Chuck Crisanto, who oversees the archiving of the compensation records, told me when I visited Manila last August that many more stories, especially from the Muslim minority, have yet to surface and to be told. But for now, the testimonial evidence from 70,000 is a source of archival power. In Chuck's office, I met a team of young librarians indexing and digitizing those records. They told me reading through the testimonies gave them nightmares. One of them said his parents were Marcos supporters, and until recently, he was completely unaware of the atrocities perpetrated by the regime. He wasn't the only one. Joey Garango, aged 25, didn't know much about his grandfather. A journalist named Primitivo Mijares, who had written a book, The Conjugal Dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, that circulated clandestinely in the 1970s. Mijares was Marcos' chief propagandist, but he defected to the opposition and published a gossipy insider account of the Marcos' corruption and lust for power. He disappeared, never heard from again, shortly after the book came out. At around the same time, his 16-year-old son was abducted, tortured, and killed, possibly thrown from a military helicopter. Joey, his grandson, was clueless about most of this. His traumatized family hardly spoke of it. Some years ago, on the r/Philippines thread on Reddit, how many of you here are on Reddit? Admit it. Come on. Reddit actually has a heroic role in this narrative. On the Our Philippines thread on Reddit, a fellow Redditor asked about the book, copies of which Joey had seen in his grandma's storeroom while he was growing up. Since then, Joey and his group of Reddit friends have annotated the book, republished it, and posted parts of it online. Today, it is a bestseller, as are other books on the Marcos era, thanks partly to Reddit. Universities and university and independent presses, along with journalists, are on the front lines of this battle to recover historical memory. They've published books and created digital archives of critical texts from the Marcos era. Much of the martial law literature is out of print, but several activists have created Google Drive folders containing the PDFs of books and underground papers, making these easily accessible. Films, photography, and art on the dictatorship are also enjoying a revival. Okay, this I know for sure. For many young people, the first research stop is Wikipedia. Am I right? Yes. So, when Carlos Nazareno, a web and game developer who once posted on Wikipedia mostly about martial arts, found out that how thin the Wikipedia entries on the Marcoses were, and that really bothered him. So he and his friends added information on plunder and human rights abuses. And this is the Wikipedia entry as of today. Many times over the past years, they have had to stay up nights to prevent revision by Marcos supporters. Some of these edit wars, he said, took place at dawn. When pro-Marcos editors objected to the use of the words dictator and kleptocrat to describe the former president, Nazareno and his colleagues put up a robust defense. They also argued for keeping the independent news site Rappler, founded by Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa, as a legitimate Wikipedia source. Earlier this year, some feared that the small museum memorializing the anti-Marcos resistance would be closed down if Ferdinand Jr. won the election. So Nazareno and his friends raised money to digitize the museum's collection of resistance papers. They could not afford a high-speed scanner, so they bought Samsung Android phones and clamped them on wooden benches. They then used a Bluetooth clicker to automate the scanning using the phone's scanner app. Very simple technology. These materials are now online. So the clandestine newsletters of my youth are now in these various online archives. From guerrilla publishing to guerrilla archiving, I feel my story has come full circle. A few months ago, popular movie star raised a furor when she said history is just gossip, in response to charges of historical revisionism by the Marcoses. We don't know what the real history is, she said, because bias comes into play. It's true, there is no objective history. What we know as historical facts, said the renowned British historian E.H. Carr, are simply those that historians have chosen as worthy of mention or scrutiny. I doubt that the movie star read E.H. Carr, but she echoed what he wrote in 1961. The best historian is the historian with the best bias, not the non-existent historian with no bias at all. Let me go farther back in history. Between 1899 and 1902, some 200,000 Filipinos, some say even 750,000 or even 1 million, the numbers are debated up to now, died from fighting, famine, and disease during the American pacification campaign in the Philippines. The US Army tortured and killed Filipino insurrectionists, forced hundreds of thousands into reconcentration camps, razed villages sympathetic to the rebellion, and massacred their inhabitants. The United States, then a rising imperial power, built and honed its counterinsurgency capabilities in the Philippines. These were the same tactics that would later be used in Vietnam and elsewhere. Yet there is no reference to this in most American and Philippine textbook histories. How many of you have heard about this history? Just 2 people. So our history, your country's and mine, are histories of erasure. Is that because our historians were biased? Did they elide this past because they were true believers in American exceptionalism and the benevolence of US colonialism? Or is it, as Trio argued, a question of power, the unequal access to the means of historical and narrative production? The ultimate mark of power is maybe its invisibility. Trio wrote, the ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots. The task of unerasing, unsilencing history requires exposing this power. Like colonial history, pro-Marcos history draws its power from violence, from the brutal silencing of the voices of dissent and resistance. Its current iteration, however, derives its power not so much from silence, but from noise. From drowning the public sphere in a deluge of myths, lies, folklore, entertaining content, and propaganda. Marcos' history is designed to justify dictatorship and restore the family to its once commanding heights. It is currently ascendant. There are other histories, other voices, but they have so far not been able to provide a compelling counter-narrative that accounts for both the darkness of dictatorship and our fumbling efforts to confront our colonial legacy and build a functioning democracy and a just society. History is a battleground, a site of struggle and resistance. From our understanding of the past, we imagine and construct a future. I will end this talk by leaving you with a question. Is it possible to build a just and democratic future on justification, evasion, and lies? My answer is no, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Great, thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you all for being here and for listening. We have some time for a reception and informal conversation, but I did want to give audience members a chance to ask a couple of questions too. Maybe we could have a couple even at a time, and then Sheila could give some thoughts, and then we'll check in online as well for any questions. So who would like to ask a question? Sure. And please introduce yourself.
Hi there, Professor. Thank you so much for a very engaging and interesting and super relevant talk. My name is Tristan Black. I'm a junior here at U of L and also have the privilege of being a research assistant within the Center for Asian Democracy, so really happy to have you here today. My question centers around the role of social media companies in the spread of disinformation. You touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious if you think individual companies should be held more responsible for stopping the spread of disinformation or at least trying to combat it, and how do you reconcile the need for content moderation with the preservation of free speech and First Amendment rights, for example?
Easy question.
Okay.
Is there one more question that we could get on the agenda, and then Professor Coronel could take both, and then we can have our more informal conversation?
I don't think I need the mic.
For online.
Oh, for online, okay. I was happy to just yell. But hi, my name is Emma. I'm also a junior at U of L in political science. And my question revolves around, I'm not super familiar with the political structure in the Philippines, so I'm just wondering what the free speech atmosphere currently looks like, especially because I know that under Duterte there were a lot of restrictions on that, so I'm kind of wondering what that looks like under the new regime, and also just like some of the laws that the Philippines has relating to free speech, because I'm sure it's not exactly the same here. So relating to Tristan's question, can we hold companies responsible in the same way we could under US law, for example?
Great, thanks. You want to take those two?
Yeah, so those are both great questions. And to your question, Tristan, there's no easy answer to that. Social media platforms definitely bear responsibility for the necessarily on illiberal thought or propaganda. These laws are weaponized by those in power. So I think the solutions would be really to rethink the business models of these companies. Rethink also, there are some certain proposals being thought about, like making these entities, for example, public utilities, just as, everything, telephones, power, they're all public utilities and therefore for the public good, and say they'll have to be regulated by the government in some way. But anything that regulates free speech, I'm a little bit nervous, because it's always, any speech regulation really tends not to protect individual people but it really tends to protect power rather than those who oppose power. In the Philippines, there are onerous laws. Libel is a criminal offense. This is why Maria Ressa, for example, has been sued for cyber libel, which is libel online. And she faces, she's currently, may go to jail if the Supreme Court, she's been convicted, so if the Supreme Court affirms her conviction, she may go to jail. And because of the criminalization of libel, it becomes very dangerous to put, and not just for journalists, but other people who post things online. There have been a number of lawsuits against ordinary people who post things on Facebook or Instagram and then get sued by private individuals. So, but I don't think censorship, as I've said, is the main constraint here. The main constraint is really there's so much noise that is allowed, so much content, some of which does not really qualify as disinformation, because it's folklore, it's glamour, it's opinion making that you don't really want to censor, because people are free, should be free to express their own opinions. But it's all this mixture of content with showbiz, with entertainment, with how do you censor a dance challenge on TikTok, right? So it's a lot of this content doesn't really fall into neat categories of fake news or disinformation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Coronel. Maybe we can thank you in a more tangible way with a small token of appreciation from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So not only a bag, but also what's in the bag. The Commonwealth is probably most famous for its bourbon, but you have to fly home tomorrow, and the TSA doesn't appreciate liquid bottles over a certain size. But we have here a small token of food-based products. The Bourbon Barrel Food Company, good friends of mine and my kitchen. So hopefully you enjoy that.
Does this have alcohol content?
Well, we can talk. It's smoked over bourbon wood. It's really good stuff, and chocolates as well, because who doesn't love that? And again, thank you all for being here. Thanks to those who tuned in online for participating. And again, check out our Facebook, social media, and website for future events, including an upcoming event within the next month on disinformation and Indian democracy, which will be a multinational streaming panel. For those who are lucky enough to be here in the room, we do have a reception for the next hour or so. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. And for those online, thanks for joining as well. Have a great afternoon.